want to bring up the Research and Action Forum number 2, and that includes Dr. Sabrina Maxwell. And Dr. Maxwell has a whole range of expertise that's directly related to this area, from her undergrad in organizational leadership, and then to conflict resolution. And then what I find most exciting, I think she's going to talk mostly about today, is her dissertation in human resource managers and the responses to toxic leadership. And I think it's a great topic, and it's actually a really nice segue from Dr. Morse's topic as well. Then we also have Dr. Lisa DeSante. And again, a huge amount of expertise and experience in dealing with workplace bullying. And she's going to give a very, I think, I'm thinking a completely unique work that I have not seen at all before, but definitely needs to be explored. And it's great that Dr. DeSante is exploring it, but I think we need even further exploration, I'm sure she would agree, about the workplace bullying in the perspective of the bully and their experiences as they go through whatever the different processes are. And those could be things like Dr. Morse was talking about, or different systems that we see. And then our third guest is Rosette Adair, who I've read her dissertation, so I'm thinking is close to the end of the PhD process. So close to being Dr. Adair, soon Dr. Adair, yes. And again, a huge level of expertise in this area. Recent research demonstrating the effects of counterproductive behaviors such as incivility and abusive supervision on employee innovative behavior, which I think is a great way to sort of couch this topic as well, and a great way to find attention from HR folks, because innovation is so critical in today's working environment. So really excited and want to welcome the three speakers, and if they have no preference, they can go in the order that they've been introduced, or whatever you're open to. But if you don't have a preference, we'll just go down the row, but if all of you would come to the front.
And I have a PhD in Applied Management Decision Science through a university called Walden University. I had the pleasure of having 3 toxic leaders in my life. Each toxic leader, which you'll understand why I use that term, led me to, I can spend a whole bunch of money on counseling, or I can go get another degree. So I have your basic bachelor's in business administration, decided to get a master's in organizational leadership, because these leaders, they just need to learn how to lead. They don't have a clue what they're doing, so I'm going to fix them, right? Get that organizational leadership degree. Well, needless to say, the beauty of toxic leadership is frequently you either leave the job or you get laid off. I'm in commercial real estate. Real estate goes like this. I've been laid off 9 times. I've relocated over 20. Just because of real estate. So I have my degree in organizational leadership, and I'm so motivated. I want to help these leaders be better leaders. Well, that didn't work so well, but hey, there's this great degree called dispute resolution. So I have a master's degree from Strauss Law Institute, Pepperdine University, in dispute resolution. Love it. Firm believer in conflict resolution. It works. It works because I've demonstrated it. I've practiced it. In my real estate business, oh, thank you. I've practiced it, and it really works. So at the same time, toxic leader number 3 really led me to where I'm at today, because it made no sense whatsoever and why I was being, as you term, bullied. I was doing my job. I was a general manager of 7 neighborhood centers. I had 800,000 square feet of retail shopping centers that I was managing. Of 8 general managers, I'm the only manager that had less than 1% accounts receivable. In other words, everybody was paying their rent. I had 0 litigation. The only manager with 0 litigation. I met all my capital projects, I was within budget, and my tenants actually got a refund on what's called Common Area Reconciliation, CAM, which is, they all pay a pro rata share of taking care of the shopping center, and I'm the one that gets laid off. Because the toxic leader felt I was a threat. In my experience, I'm also a single mother of 3 children and have 5 grandchildren. And it was very difficult raising 3 children because I needed my job. I had to know that I could make sure there was food on the table. So it was very difficult. But this toxic leader realized that I was somewhat of a threat. In my research, I came across the Coca-Cola Company and aerospace that has some excellent programs that when I'm done here, I'm going to make them as a recommendation, kind of a segue on what Dr. Morse had recommended. I've read the EI book, Emotional Intelligence. I've heard about Dr. Goleman, and they're great. They're phenomenal. So my experience with my 3rd toxic leader, I do need my shoe, led me to realize that there's lots and lots and lots of information out there already from people who've been abused, bullied, left without a job, and it wasn't meeting my need. I couldn't really add to existing literature. My niece works for a company who I will not say, but she works in human resources. We got to talking, and I realized that, you know, it's the organizational side that there's no literature, there's no information. How does the organization deal with these toxic people? So it just so happened she was currently in a litigation issue. Through our discussion, I realized there's an organization called SHROOM, Society of Human Resource, who has a sub-chapter called PIRA, Professional Institute of Human Resources. So I was able to go to PIRA, get them to allow me to interview some of those who are willing to be interviewed, who are resource individuals, managers, and let me do some data collection under a phenomenological study. So although a lot of my data is qualitative and quantitative, the study itself was phenomenological because I got to interview them and see, how did you deal with this? What was your emotion? What did you feel? And you would be surprised, though, even you've got your employees who are being bullied, the HR people are terribly affected negatively by this toxic leader. So why do I keep saying toxic leader? Let me see if I can figure out how to work this here. Let's see. There we go. There's Kellerman. Some of you may or may not know Kellerman as an author. Good leadership leaves a person feeling supported. Bad leadership can lead to feelings of rejection, confusion, and destroy team atmosphere. Toxic leadership destroys teams, causes emotional harm, and financial harm to industries and teams. The gentleman here, Schmidt, he did a fascinating study. He recently got his doctorate, but at the time he did a master's. He was able to go onto an army base that had civilians, and he was able to do a study where he was able to interview civilian, army leaders, personnel, and he came up with his definition. The behaviors that the toxic leader specifically displays is narcissistic, abusive, authoritarian, unpredictable, and self-promoting. Bullying can fall under abuse because there's emotional abuse, there's physical abuse, there's bullying abuse. So the narcissist, if you read Freud's definition, is that person that kind of says, so what part of my world do you not get? It's about me, okay? And it's actually a dysfunctional personality, the narcissist. Because they truly do not get that you don't get, but it's not about me. And that is their dysfunction. The abusive, of course, is bullying, because you're an awful person. The authoritarian this is the way it is. If you don't like it, you're gonna leave. You will do this, which is, kind of falls under the bullying also. The unpredictable is the one that I find to be most emotionally damaging. Don't all of you who've been bullied feel like you have to walk on eggshells around this individual? Oh my gosh, what kind of mood is he in? What is she gonna do to write me up? What have I done now? I'm afraid to open that email. That's the unpredictable. So, and then of course self-promoting. They take credit for what the team did. Of course I'm great. Look at what I've done. Look at all this income. Look at millions of dollars that I've brought. Look how I've turned the team around. So senior management doesn't actually see the problem. They don't actually know what this individual's really doing in harm. Or they say, well, we hear it, but look what he's doing, more profit margin, etc. So that's why I like this term for a toxic leader. So in my case, there was a lack of understanding in organizations on how they identify, how they manage, and how they handle toxic leaders. What does the organization do? In the, I won't go through everything. I'm going to try to do it quickly because I know we have essence of time. I do have some copies that are around. If any of you would like to look up the literature or read it, by all means, let me know. I can certainly give you that too. But basically, the problem statement was, how do we find out what do they do? Oops. So I wanted to share with anyone I can on how HR manages this issue. How do they identify, how do they manage, and how do they handle consequences? Because there are consequences, whether it's financial, defacing, it's all something that they have to deal with. This is actually the part of the dissertation which, again, the scope I've defined. It was the PIRA individuals. It was face-to-face interviews. But here's what's interesting to me. Originally, when I collected my data, the goal was to have 25 HR people. Now, that doesn't sound like too many in the world of human resources, does it? But guess what? They're afraid to share. They're afraid to share because they represent the company. It's a potentially problem with their licensing. They're going to be bullied. So the end result was I had 14 individuals who were willing, through PIRA, all confidential. I'm a firm believer in confidentiality statements. I had them sign a confidentiality agreement. They were willing to interview, quote, face-to-face. And at the end of it all, I only ended up with 9. So that says something about the toxic leader and the organization in itself. So more research needs to be done, but to me, that speaks mountains on what I've discovered. So the idea was social change, which is what Dr. Morth talked about. How do we make this different? And I have several definitions that I won't go through because of the sense of time. The population, as I stated, was with the PIRA organization. It was really needed trustworthiness. They needed to be comfortable that I was going to keep this confidential, that I wasn't going to blurb their names out and go, oh my gosh, just hear this story about so-and-so. Do you know this company does that? No way. You know, it was very, very important to be quite confidential. So here's what I found. Companies do not try to identify leaders when they're hired. State law prevents companies from performing. Because my thinking is, well, can't you just give them some kind of a personality test? Because they're very identifiable if you watch them, or through testing, they are identifiable. Good Lord, I should have different shoes. But
Sometimes the bottom.
yeah, just take them off. But we're not allowed to give those personality tests. The negative consequences trickle down. They really do. So you have your toxic leader, and pretty soon you've got people within the department that are not, or even your lead man people, or your managers versus your leaders. It trickles down. HR is equally disturbed by the conflict. HR frequently has to act as a moderator. Interestingly enough, though, human resource people don't have conflict resolution training professionally. Now, they do have some coursework they have to take, but the actual MDR process or ADR process, they really aren't. Plus, in order to be a viable dispute resolution, it has to be an outside person, a third party neutral. That's the key. And a confidentiality agreement must be in place. HR is not a third party neutral. They represent the company. They represent the organization. So that's a problem. Toxic leaders are discovered by employees leaving. How true is that? One government organization, one of the interviewees worked for government, indicated that there was a loss of over 25% in one department within 1 quarter that made them go, uh-oh, what's going on here? That's serious. The HR people begin the whole process by interviewing because, of course, it's always the employee. Okay, this employee has a problem. This employee maybe needs some training or talking to or needs to be written up for behavior. So that's kind of where they originally start, is down the road of interviewing the employee to find out what exactly is going on. But pretty soon, it gets a little bigger and a little bigger and a little bigger, and pretty soon they have this issue that they realize is not the employee, but actually the leader. Then they go to senior management and say, what do you want to do? Because we need some help here. Well, interestingly enough, 5 of the 9 stated that when HR went to senior management and senior management went to the toxic leader, they would file a wrongful termination. Within 5 months, HR would see this, all of a sudden, this dip in behavior, which said we have a problem. The wrongful termination or the suit that the leader would put against the company sometimes took 18 months to resolve, some or more. The leader, toxic leader, also ended up with, if they left the company, they would ended up over $60,000, some as much as $250,000 to just go away. And their organization stuck with the legal fees. The toxic leader displays those specific 5 behaviors. Yes, because what was interesting is Dr. Morris was talking about coaching. Coaching is something that HR does recommend. These persons that I interviewed did say that we do hire consulting, we do hire coaching. But the coaching works for a period of time. If it's a true toxic leader, it works for a period of time because the person says, oh, I better shape up. Okay, fine, I'll play the game. But once the coaching goes away, they're back to their original behavior because that's who they are. However, if it's someone that's maybe 1 or 2 of those traits, say they are an abusive person, they're not necessarily narcissistic authoritarian, they're just abusive. And they pay attention to the coach, they can change behavior. So that's the interesting part. But the true toxic leader, they are who they are. And in my experience, interestingly enough, my 3rd toxic person that I worked underneath, once she'd managed to get the entire department laid off, they let her go. It took 2.5 years, and she did leave with $150,000 in her pocket and a statement that, I've decided to retire. Within 6 months, she was hired by another company.
Of course.
So much for retired. So there's value in providing support and training for HR managers in dealing with this conflict, because they need that support. The unpredictable fashion of toxic leaders act in an unpredictable fashion. The human resource may not have the power or ability to totally control that leader. Terminating a leader then becomes problematic, though not impossible. The participants, as I stated, led to a cost of outside consultants, legal aids, and HR must have the support of senior management in order to change or address the toxic situation. Without senior management support, human resources can't manage this conflict. So positive social change along with increased knowledge of process and procedures are two of the benefits of this research. The camaraderie of human resource representatives will be able to compare their current procedure with the process applied in this review, exchange and expand some learning and process and knowledges. And PIRA is an extremely good organization under SHROOM. SHROOM, I believe, is a little more active out here in the East Coast. And I believe that if we can get them involved in some of the conflict resolution programming and training, and they make that a viable part of their certification, then I think that will really help. So, although I have written some recommendations, I have my own recommendations. And before I do that, actually, I wanted to just quickly read, and I won't take much time, but I just quickly wanted to read just a quick list of some of the subjects of the coding that was done in the data when I did the data analysis. Acquiring toxic leaders with eMERGE was very high. It takes a collective effort in order to address the toxic leader. Toxicity emerges within the company typically about 5 months shortly thereafter. New leaders can be negative if they themselves are toxic, which is obvious. Discussing the behavior with the toxic leader turns out to be negative because you have your retaliation. Discussing with senior management completely depends on what type of senior management you have. Trickle-down effect is, we all can acknowledge that. It's like a dominoes effect. It starts here and it ends up, and the little guy on the bottom of the row is the one that gets let go. The effects that HR saw was filing workman's compensation. It was quite high because that's what happens. They'll file workman's compensation. So whether the company's dealing with a legal issue of work comp or a legal issue of the toxic leader, knowledge is what is really sharing knowledge and sharing process is the only way to handle it. Employees exit. That was the first acknowledgement and identification of a toxic leader. Human resources has to be the cheerleader through the entire thing. Keep your employees motivated so we don't have a rebellion in the workplace. And that's quite difficult for HR to be the cheerleader. It's going to be okay. I can't really tell you why. I can't guarantee when, but it's going to be okay. So don't quit. Hang in there. Stay with us. That's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to do. All of them recommended that the quicker you can handle a toxic leader and exit them stage left, the quicker, the better, the sooner, the less harm done. Legal assistance is almost always required. There's an extremely low percentage of reporting toxic behavior or bullying. And the effects stay with you long term. I thought that was really interesting that even HR people acknowledge and recognize that this is not a healthy environment. This is not a healthy experience in your life, and it will stay with you. Toxic leaders can't self-identify. So a real toxic person, as I said, the narcissism comes into play, and they're like, I don't understand what you're telling me. What do you mean? I don't get it. Which is just unbelievable to me, but that's what they showed. Toxic leaders destroy process, believe if they have power that they can do what they want to do. Toxic leaders do not have people skills, which is what Dr. Morris had also said. They are typically very intelligent, but just not good with people. And also there's a lack of accountability held by the organization for the toxic leader. And the interesting part was that if the toxicity isn't managed and handled right away and quickly, it will continue to repeat over and over. So those I thought were just some interesting codes that just sort of support what we're all about, what we're here for. And I would like to recommend a couple of things. First and foremost, all of the individuals that I interviewed who are in human resources all said one of the best factors that they can have is a really good updated employee handbook, and have a no tolerance policy in the handbook. No tolerance to however you want to define it, and of course the attorneys need to figure out how that's defined specifically, but a no tolerance. It's really important to have the toxic leader sign that piece of paper. Following that, you have approximately 5 months, 6 months depending, on a training session, wherein each and every month, not that leader, maybe that leader as a new hire, but leaders are required to be trained. They're trained in understanding policy. So we not only have you signed this piece of paper that says you understand our employee handbook, but we also are following up with a policy. This is our policy wherein bullying is included in that policy training. After that, you have leadership training. There's all kinds of wonderful, emotional intelligence is a wonderful training. There's something called a situational leadership that's an excellent, excellent training skill. You also train them about the charismatic leader, which is not always good. Charismatic can be good, can be not good. So every month you take a day or half a day or a few hours and you have them trained. So you have the documentation as an organization. They've been told, they've been taught, they signed the paper, and it's continual. They don't just go one day and never go ever again. But every year they have to do it again, and it doesn't take a lot of time and it doesn't take a lot of money because HR can do it. Then you also have them trained on communication skills. As Dr. Morris mentioned too, while he was here, there's a very, very, very important concepts in communication. First and foremost, we all use feeling words when you really mean thinking. I feel like you don't like me. No, I think you don't like me and I feel hurt. Example, 70% of nonverbals are communication. And in technology, it's great, but that's gone. There is no nonverbal in communication in technology, and you're missing 70% of the information. All of us are really bad listeners. There's a very, very, very difficult skill in listening to what that individual is saying and actually conceptually understanding what they're saying. Because what happens is, the second she starts talking, my brain wants to answer her. So shutting off the brain and hearing, and then saying, so what I heard you say is, da-da-da-da-da-da. Toxic leaders are really bad at that because they're narcissistic. It's all about me. I don't care what you said, this is what we're doing. So if they've had this communication training, along with other forms of communication training, and it's ongoing, that at least is proof for the organization that they've done what they can do so they can eliminate the toxic leader quicker with less legal fees. Then also there's team training. In that can be dignity at the workplace, team training. And last but not least, I really recommend that many more organizations do what Coca-Cola and the aerospace has done and bring in-house ombuds. In-house ombuds already used in schools and some other public organizations, but in a business scenario, the ombuds person has an open door policy. The ombuds person doesn't necessarily have to be at the company. The ombuds person doesn't necessarily answer, actually they don't answer to HR. They answer to senior management. So HR is freed up from that responsibility or in that stuck between a rock and a hard spot. And the best part is they are allowed, per the definition of ADR, to have any individual sign a confidentiality agreement. Therefore, if they're called into court, they can say, I'm sorry, sir, I can't answer that question. So that allows complete freedom for any individual who would like to speak to an ombuds. On-site, off-site, email, what's it called?
Via
Camera.
Stop It? Or on the phone?
Yeah, cameras. And I think that might be a recommendation that certainly should be tried because in 2011, the statistics, 2009, 2011, were really, really positive between the aerospace industry and Coca-Cola. And I've spent enough time with ombudspersons who are trained enough that I think that might be a way. And her Stop It tool and Dr. Morse's recommendations on EIs would work well with an ombudsperson. And when you do the finances, when you see what it's costing in legal fees, organizations are going to go, well, I can't afford an ombuds. They want to, I can't. Yes, you can. Because at the end of the day, you're going to retain employees. You're going to retain tacit knowledge. You're going to retain faith in the organization. And you'll not have to constantly train, and you're not going to have those legal fees. So that's my spiel on what I've found out. I'm hoping to become very involved in workplace bullying.
So thank you for having me here. I'm excited to share my research. I've done this only a couple of other times with some professional groups, including a SHRM group in a nearby county where we live. So I wanted to get the word out about this research because it is new and it is different. But just a little bit of a background about myself. I work as organizational development consultant, and I'm a professional coach as well. And my client base includes a very technical, scientific group of customers overall who work in this isolated Navy research development lab in the middle of this desert, and I won't go on about it. But as I got into my doctorate, what I really wanted to study was emotions in organizations, because I saw that as really being the key factor to some of the dysfunctions and issues I saw occurring between individuals, within work teams, between organizations. So as I studied what I might study and research for the dissertation, I stumbled upon this topic of workplace bullying. And I had never heard of it. I just had never heard of it up until a couple of years ago. And the more I read about it, the more intrigued I became. And I realized, hey, I've seen this. I've worked in groups like this, where this has existed. I've actually coached individuals who fit the description of a workplace bully. And I've also worked with targets. And in the process of my study, I also realized I could have been perceived as a workplace bully in another work environment. And I wanted to learn more. I wanted to learn more about the bully as understood by the bully, him or herself. And I want to share with you my research. So I probably need the clicker, don't I?
It's on the table.
Oh, thanks. So I'll go over workplace bullying. I think I'll be able to do that pretty quickly because a number of the other speakers have already addressed some of those key points, and then talk with you more about the research itself, what I found. You'll hear narratives from each of the different themes I identified as a result of my analysis, along with some recommendations. So I'll hit on this just real briefly. The reason why there is no one common agreed to definition of workplace bullying out there is because it does not exist in the literature. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but in actuality, a key part of the debate in the research seems to be not only around the length of time these repeated negative events happen, but it's also around intentionality. And that's a real sticking point for some. Now I have it bolded here, this second definition in particular, because I really wanted to examine that in my own research. We've already looked at some contributors. I don't see anything beyond what has already been mentioned here to add, except that around organizational systems. This is a really interesting point to me, is though they can be set up to protect employees, they can also be used to abuse employees. Not just the target, find out here soon, perhaps even for the bully. We know it's all over the place, no workplace is immune, it's global, and we already have gone over the costs. we have some idea about who the typical target is, and we've already gone over some of this, some of the other speakers too, but we know them to be pretty competent. You know, these are high performers. They're well liked, they're collaborative, they're very tied into what they're doing, their sense of purpose and their identity with the group, with the organization, with the work that they do. And what the irony is, the literal painful irony here is, bullying is driving out our best. That is the irony. And we've got a narrative from a bully. For 17 years, I gave my heart and energy to my job. Finally, the many years of abuse took its toll. When arriving at work one morning, I couldn't enter the building. I never returned. It's been 4 years. I've had therapy, and even now, as we talk about it, I am so agitated. I had several panic attacks, and I thought I was dying. The suffering there is just amazing. And how many years, really, did she have to drive up to the office under that duress? Just amazing. So we have some characterizations of the bully emerging as well, and we've heard some of them already. Thank you, Sabrina, and some others. Thank you. These shouldn't look any different from what we've already heard about, but in essence, we do find them to be these egomaniac, pathological, very sick, narcissistic people. So goes the characterization. 3 times more likely to be a supervisor than a peer or coworker. Men are more likely than women to bully. Of the women who bully, just to mention, they're more likely to bully other women. And there are all sorts of social factors associated with that, likely cultural too. There was a study done key study done in Australia that gives us a first glimpse into what the bully experiences following an accusation. This one says, it affected me severely. I became suicidal. Seriously, I was devastated, mortified, and began to question what I had done and to whom. It was the worst period of my life. I experienced my first ever panic attack. I felt I could trust no one, and I became deeply depressed. That really struck me when I read that, because it seems so similar to what we read just a moment ago from the target's perspective, right? And who'd have thought this individual is not exactly portraying some of the stereotypes we have. Clearly, the individual is feeling, is being vulnerable, and has no idea how what he created occurred, and he is devastated. So we see similar symptoms, not just in targets, perhaps even in those who have been accused.
What was that citation from that one?
It's Jenkins, Weinfeld, and Saris. I have a list of references at the end,
Okay.
because you can pull it up from there. So that's where I wanted to go in my study. I wanted to find out what really is going on here. What do we know about the bully? Well, it turns out it's regarded as the black hole of research, because there is extremely little research on the bully as told to from the bully's voice, the perspective here. Well, it's pretty easy to understand why that's so. No one really wants to raise their hand and volunteer and acknowledge themselves as a bully. It's also very difficult to observe this real time in the moment. There are all sorts of barriers to this. However, there are some key studies that are just now coming out. The Jenkins, what they actually did was they compiled a wealth of data from some interviews and produced 2 journal articles that are in my.
Just saw the other one.
Okay, very good. They're excellent.
Yeah.
They're just excellent. So I wanted to leverage that. Suggested in the article was even how did they cope? And that's what I wanted to study. And so that's where I went. So here are my research questions. I wanted to know to what extent do these workplace bullies experience cognitive dissonance? And I'll define that more, but think of it more as a disconnect for now. Following an accusation or an allegation. Disconnect in terms of how they view themselves and as compared with how they are viewed by others. And what are the ways in which they reduce that dissonance, that discomfort? How do they then recover? Or not? So let's talk a little bit about cognitive dissonance. What is that? Well, it's a famous sociological theory developed by Leon Festinger more than 50 years ago. It has stood the test of time, believe it or not. Mostly because it's extremely simple in its articulation, but it's so well crafted. In essence, he says, we desire some consistency between our sense of self, how we view ourselves, our self-concept, and the behaviors and actions that we take. We want to see some consistency there. And when we do something to upset that balance, we experience a sort of psychological discomfort, or what he terms a physiological drive in some cases, right? We're motivated to reset the balance so that we're back to a relative balance. So the greater the dissonance, the greater the desire to make the change. We experience cognitive dissonance multiple times throughout the day. Even myself, here today. I like to think of myself as an educated person who's presented numerous times, and yet what is all this nervousness that's going on in me? Because I'd rather be sitting way back in the corner room and watching everyone else, right? But one way that I can adjust that disequilibrium, the discomfort that I'm feeling, is to add some new cognitions around what I'm doing. Okay, first of all, I can say, I know this is really important to me. This is really a life mission. This is my calling. I need to do this. And so I'm just going to step up and persevere, right? So my behaviors on top of that are pushing me up here, and I'm strangely feeling a little bit better, but I'll be better this evening around 7 o'clock with a glass of wine. Until then, we'll find out. That's another dissonance reduction strategy. I shouldn't get ahead of myself. But smokers do the same thing. We're educated about the ill effects of smoking. And what do smokers do? Those who continue, well, they might change some of the ways they think about it. They might deny it. They might, the findings, they might point to other examples where their parents are 90 years old and still smokers and have not had any problem. They may even stop smoking. Those are dissonance reduction strategies where we establish a consonance between how we think of ourselves, our actions, and our behaviors. So far, so good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I engage in this phenomenological study, very similar, where I wanted to engage with the bullies, right? Kind of difficult, but I wanted to get the essence of their experience, and what better way than to engage them as closely as I possibly could. So I advertised, oh my gosh, I advertised everywhere. But I started my advertisements in those communities where they had universities and medical centers. Why? Well, guess what? There's an increased prevalence of bullying in those fields. Unfortunately, it's so. But I also went to Google, I went to social networks, I went to my own networks. I developed a web page, and so in the ad was a link to the web page that talked about the study, pointed them to this survey I developed, and at the end, they were also invited to take part in a telephone interview. Again, this would all be anonymous. I had set up a 1-800 phone call, phone number, so that I could communicate by way of our the website, and they could do so still from a point of anonymity. And so I was able to get one phone interview. I got a total of 14 surveys. I would have loved to have had more phone interviews. Now, mind you, I know several people who fulfill the bill of workplace bully. However, I cannot go in and ask them, especially as their coach. It just wouldn't go over well. But I did get 14. Demographic information was voluntary, but of those who provided it, the majority of the 14 were male, and their average age was mid-50s. I then engaged, looked at all the data, interview data, and the survey data, open-ended questions, and conducted a thematic analysis. And from that, I identified 5 themes, okay, and I'll walk you through those. One is around what perspective did they demonstrate? What was that level of awareness they demonstrated in their narratives, in their responses? Was it self-centric? Was it work-centric? Was it other-centric? Did they demonstrate an awareness of others? The second was justification. What was their reasoning that they came up with in those explanations, right? Was it their own expectations, that sense of self-justification, or was it something they were directed by others to do, so other justification? There was also a theme around punishment, and that was quite telling, quite surprising as well. But they experienced a multitude of interpersonal punishments as inflicted by others, and also some professional punishments, as we've already come to see exist. And then they also showed some changes in how they thought and how they behaved, changes in terms of their level of trust of others, some self-protection, protective behaviors that they engaged in, and interestingly, some newfound self-awareness. And then finally, there were remedies that they took part in around self-development and really escape and exit. And so I've got some narratives for each of those things to share with you. So here is Lloyd, and these are from Google, so this really isn't Lloyd, just so you know. And this represents the perspective taking of self and work. I realized I was a leader with a reputation for turning around underperforming organizations by setting standards, holding people accountable, and weeding out those who could not change previously acceptable behaviors, but surprised at the label of bully. Look at justification, self and other. The CEO told me, says Patty, when you see something that is not correct and or not up to our company's standards, and you do not say and or do anything about it, it sends 2 messages. 1, you don't care. 2, you are too stupid to notice. Our corporate office selected and recruited me for the very skills I'm being accused of being a bully over. Punishment, interpersonal and professional. This is Martin. The people in my direct department, they pretty much ostracized me. I'm dealing with unemployment, ostracism, legal expenses, financial woes, strained relationships, lost friendships, self-doubt, and the feeling I've been treated unfairly and unjustly. It really lessens my job chances. I don't even know if I qualify to get a job at Walmart. In this particular case, this individual had worked with the company for 18 years. Changes in cognitions and behaviors from April. I'm doubly careful that when my actions are not framed in a way that could be used in that bullying way, I am clear on tasks and timelines, and I help my staff as much as I can, but when people aren't meeting their goals, I let them know ASAP, and then have a witness with me for all performance meetings. I didn't have a witness at the time I was accused, so it was easy for my boss to reconstruct the story to suit his own purposes. I also script where I can and write minutes. So the energy clearly going into covering one's, yeah. And then remedy, what were some of the fixes? Thank you. Here's Carl. I'm trying to communicate well, uphold ideals and aspirations in my organization without being perceived as insensitive. It's very confusing, frankly. I've moved from job to job about every 7 years. Almost all of them engaged in self-development, and yet guess what? Almost all of them wanted to leave. So what were the findings? Nearly all denied bullying, and they expressed shock at the accusation. Their reactions in total indicated no conscious intent. Okay? Participants indicated clarity about their intention, and we saw that in terms of that overarching theme around self-awareness or perspective taking and self-awareness, right? Their concern was self and work. They didn't show perspective oriented toward others, which would seem to fall in line with that sense of lack of empathy. Most justified their behaviors as expected for what was called for in the job. And guess what? As soon as that accusation was leveled, leadership, senior leadership, seemed to distance themselves from those accused. So they were sort of flailing. There was no support for them. Some became more self-aware, and that's called, I think one other researcher called this the silver lining around this distressing topic overall is they did become more self-aware. But they also became so much more self-protective. They didn't know who to trust. There was no expression or desire to seek retribution. None of that came through in the study. And some believed that they were victims of upwards bullying. And I don't think I've heard that term yet today, but that in essence is a concept that says my subordinates are bullying me as their manager, right? Now, as a manager, I'm not going to go up my chain and report instances of bullying because
You are the manager.
absolutely, I'm incompetent, otherwise I can't say that I am. However, a number of them, even in the Jenkins' work, were saying that it exists far more than we realize. And on top of that, they believe that of those managers who are being bullied, when they step into those positions, there's this belief that they have to endure that level of behavior or abuse. It comes with the territory, and so I better suck it up. Now again, some sought out improvement, most of them sought out improvement. That came in the form of coaching, of feedback, of training, real work, right? At the same time, they also wanted to find work elsewhere. All of them expressed a desire to work elsewhere. Now, these align with the very few studies I have seen so far on workplace bullying as told from the perspective of the bully. And you can see they're all fairly recent, with the exception of Laura Krasha. You've heard her, she's the boss whisperer, and she did somewhat of a case study incorporating customers, clients that she has worked with. The Jenkins et al., that's two studies in essence. I referenced one right there, though. So do they experience dissonance? According to my research, yes, they do, and it's demonstrated by these various reduction strategies they also employ. Interestingly, just to explain what self-affirmation is, that's another concept. It's one of those concepts or theories around, yeah, I did that, but I'm going to restore and emphasize some of the better parts, my better qualities about who I am, to sort of lift myself up as a higher level person. I've actually got more worth than that one little instance with that employee would indicate. And so I still feel pretty good about myself. Recommendations. My recommendations fall in line with a lot of those that have already been offered by you. It is not an individual issue. It is a social phenomenon, and it engages the entire work system. I cannot emphasize that enough. Silence is a form of behavior, as entrenched as it may be in fear by the target and by the bystanders and by the lead who looks the other way. It is a behavior. It too needs to be heard. That psychological safety Alan was talking about is key. So I am suggesting training, and much longer term training, as Sabrina was even mentioning. It's not enough. The one-time, spot-on, real-time training is not enough. It needs to have ongoing support. And guess what? Those targets and victims and bystanders, they're in need of ongoing, longer-term support as well. So I'm suggesting we engage the entire organization. and the leadership as well. Let us not forget Edgar Schein. You guys have heard of him?
Mhm.
He said that leadership and culture are two sides of the same coin, right? We cannot affect change without engaging leadership. Here's some limitations I've identified. It's a small sample. It's one of just a few out there, and so it's very hard to generalize, you guys, but this is at least a first important glimpse into this area that we really don't understand from a more comprehensive, full perspective. We just don't have that balanced perspective just yet, but we're getting there. What we know right now is based primarily on the target and the bystander accounts. Let's see, the other thing around, it's possible that people were responding with what they thought they should be saying, right? And so there's some inherent bias around the responses. Got to be mindful about that. Policies around workplace bullying are scarce, and then the definition of workplace bullying remains a huge obstacle. How do I know what they're referring to as workplace bullying actually does refer to the same sort of example as is being cited by others who have experienced it? What's the context for them? So takeaways are workplace bullying is a social phenomenon affecting everyone. The target and bully experience, so it would seem, mirror forms of suffering. Dehumanizing the bully contributes to, and I believe perpetuates, the abuse and the loss of dignity. I also believe there does exist a continuum of abuse, and bullying from one extreme to another it has not yet been developed, the framework that's all encompassing. I think Catherine's got a really good framework that she has listed in her book as well. I've seen other frameworks too, but I think what it speaks to is the fact that there are too many variations and perceptions around what one constitutes bullying, and what is a norm for others falls within that realm of norm. Most of those accused expressed shock and wanted to improve, and they took part in improvement. So the bullying stereotypes I challenge. I know that there are extremes, and I'm also aware, at least in one environment, I could have been perceived as a bully. It wasn't my intent, but I can understand how someone could have perceived me in that way.
So hello everyone. First of all, I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to participate today in this process on this very important topic. I'm really excited about the fact that people are still engaged. We've been grappling with this issue for over 30 years, I think, a really long time. But I'm excited that people haven't given up yet, are still engaged with the topic. So thank you so much. I have good news and bad news. All right. The good news is that because I'm going almost last, towards the end of the day, most of the material that I was going to present has already been presented. So I was sitting there crossing things out, going done, 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 done. So hopefully I will, be able to get through this rather fast, so that we're able to get into the Q&A discussion. The bad news, okay? The bad news is that, unfortunately, I'm not crazy. It means that all the patterns that I've been seeing in research and in my professional life, that others have seen as well. That's not good for us as a society. So that's, that's the mixed bag there. The fact that there's so many agreements and so many heads nodding, that's not so great. So I'm going to try and go quickly. So my topic, let me just go back one more. So I'm talking about creativity and the fact that creativity is definitely impacted in the workplace, particularly employee creativity or employee innovation behavior. I think we talked this morning about why do we hire people. We hire them for their ideas, we hire them for their energy, we hire them to be productive. And so We want our organizations to perform well based on the talents. That's why it's called talent searching. Okay? And yet, when we have these behaviors, the behaviors of workplace bullying happening, it is my proposal that that doesn't quite work very well. What is creativity? Okay, so let's look at a couple of quotations. There is no doubt that creativity is the most important human resource of all. Without creativity, there will be no progress, and we'll be forever repeating the same patterns. Okay? And then a new idea is delicate. It can be killed by a sneer or a yawn. It can be stumped to death by a quip and worried to death by a frown on the right man's brow. Again, gentlemen, not just to, not to point out, it could be any, the right person's brow. If that person's opinion is important, definitely. That's something to think about. So I put those quotations together, or those quotes together, to demonstrate that A, creativity is very important, but B, creativity is also very fragile. It can easily be destroyed. Okay? What is creativity? Is the process of birthing new solutions for new dilemmas, or coming up with new tools or new services for otherwise, boring things. Okay, so before the wheel was created, somebody was very exhausted trying to push loads down, and it wasn't very, very exciting to do so. And so they sat down and said, maybe I better create a wheel, and that will make things a little bit easier. It is a way to look at things from fresh eyes or fresh perspective. An employee's intentional introduction or application for new ideas, products, processes, and procedures to the work role, work unit, as well as organization. So it's not isolated. You have to look at creativity within the context of the organization and the connections and relationships within that organization. I'm going to skip through this. We've looked at various definitions of workplace bullying today for the sake of some of our younger students, perhaps who are looking at the literature now. There's tons of stuff there. And you heard today that we haven't quite agreed on what the definition is. We're still looking at what our definition in the US is. Canada has its own definition. Australia has its own definition. New Zealand has its own definition. Norway has been at this for a very long time. They have their own definition. We haven't quite come up with a definition just yet. So we're still grappling with what we think our definition is. However, literature agrees in terms of some of the things that even, I believe, the psychologist brought up today. So the issue of incivility, the victimization, abusive supervision, which might be a brother to or sister to the toxic leadership or cousin to toxic leadership we talked about today. Disruptive practitioner behavior, mobbing, and somebody mentioned what mobbing is, when lots of people rush you kind of thing. Employee abuse, workplace aggression, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there are many descriptors of what workplace bullying looks like, feels like in the workplace. We do have a working definition, repeated. Somebody talked about many over time. It could be 6 months. That has been a period that's been mentioned in the literature as well. So it is repeated, it is persistent, it is negative. It could be towards one person, it could be towards a group of people, either because of where they're situated in the company, or because maybe they're new, or because they're maybe the disability. It could be so many other reasons why these individuals could be targeted or seen as the weak link. Again, which create or contribute to a hostile work environment. Now, the term hostile work environment is well known. The ESC rep attorney left, but it's a term that's well known in the literature of litigation, what a hostile workplace environment looks like. Various manifestations of what workplace bullying is. This is a quick review. Unjustified reprimands is a big one. Social isolation and how that affects the creative process. Open negative criticism resulting in shaming, and we talked about shaming today quite a bit. Withholding critical information needed for task completion. Now, if you want me to be creative and to complete this task, if you withdraw funds, if you withdraw teammates that I can work with, if you isolate me, if you take away my equipment, that hinders my ability to be productive in that regard. Again, work-related isolation and exclusion, unrealistic goals and deadlines, okay? That's a big one. So I throw a big project at you and I say, oh, by the way, it's due by tomorrow morning. Guess who's gonna be up all night? You, okay? Devaluing the work performance and the effects of that, okay? And of course, subsequent denial of performance-related benefits. So very quickly, Reina and Hall came up with, when you're looking at workplace bullying, the kinds of effects that it has to the person or even to the organization. It is a threat to professional status, okay? So we talked about people who walked away. There are people in the room who decided, okay, maybe I was working towards seniority, but it's not worth it. You know, I would rather just, you know, leave with whatever health I still got, okay? So threat to professional status. So you lose your professional status when you exit. Your seniority or your career standing. Threat to personal standing within the organization. When you're a target and then people start to look at you funny. Maybe he's crazy or maybe she's crazy. Maybe she's weird. So you begin to even self-doubt. Threat to belonging to the community. You're isolated. Threat to accomplishment, again, which is related to number one, and then threat to stability. Okay. Before I go back to before I go to that, I want to just pause there for a minute and just talk about. So workplace bullying is increasingly being recognized as a serious source of negative impact on employee productivity and workplace climate. Okay. So my dissertation, Dr. Calvo mentioned these red portions of my dissertation. I really look at the impacts of workplace bullying on the climate within the organization itself. Along with that, of course, is the ability to be creative within that environment. And there's tons of literature if you're interested in that. I'm happy to share that with you as well. Major trends in the literature reveal that employees who experience workplace bullying have lower job satisfaction, poor job performance, reduced productivity, poor motivation, increased task-related errors, and are less connected to the job and organization. We've seen, again today, many presenters sharing examples of where that would be the case. Where if somebody keeps, just nitpicking, after a while, even tasks that you knew really well how to do, you begin to make errors. And then now they've got you. Oh, your performance has gone really low. And you're looking at it and say, I used to do this very well. Okay, I know cases of nurses who knew how to do simple procedures, okay? Give medication, take, a blood sample, and then all of a sudden, because they were being bullied, they couldn't even find a vein. And this is something they have practiced for a really long time. What has happened? Then, of course, then the abusive supervisor or even the colleagues are saying, see, you can't do it, okay? And the person begins to doubt their own ability to do so. So workplace, so the errors become more apparent. I'm skipping over a huge section. A study conducted by Hollis in 2012 specified, so what are some of the effects? Specific to higher education found that on average, participants reported that an estimated 3.9 hours a week were spent dealing with the bullying. Now you're talking about faculty. Her own group, the group that she studied were members of the faculty, junior and some even senior. And she realized that they were losing time. I mean, they were missing office time, some of them were missing class time, their research was suffering because they're trying to stay away from maybe the head of department who's a bully or another colleague who's a bully and so on and so forth. Given that Holly's study reported 62% positive indications of workplace bullying experiences, she estimates that a small liberal arts college of about 1,900 employees, for example, stands to lose over $8 million to the effects of workplace bullying annually. Okay? And there is another study that I cite here of 5,000 employees where they did a study and they realized that at least 1 million workdays, collectively, 1 million workdays were lost 1 year due to bully avoidance. So if you're not at work engaged with your colleagues, if you're not at work maybe in a research group, if you're not if you're not sitting at your desk coming up with great ideas, you're staying away from this bully, chances are you're not engaged in creative behavior. The person who provided it is Keelan, 2000. Some researchers estimate that the cost of workplace bullying to organizations ranges from about $17,000 to $24,000 per case. And that's Gosh 2011 as well as Hollis 2012. So, how does workplace bullying affect employee innovative behaviors, and what is the appropriate managerial and organizational response to mitigate the negative effects and foster a climate of creativity and innovative behavior? Okay, so the theoretical grounding that I use is there we go. Okay, so POS stands for Perceived Organizational Support. And perceived organizational support is linked to the general feeling of support and care within the organization. Somebody else called it, is it an ethics of care or an atmosphere of care? Somebody actually mentioned something earlier that actually touches on this a little bit. This is when employees sense that the organization for which they work rates their contributions highly and is committed to them and their welfare. Okay, so that's one of scaffolding that I use. The other one is psychological contract, which again is usually wrapped up within perceived organizational support. The psychological contract refers to the way the employment relationship is interpreted, okay, understood and enacted by the employee in interaction with his or her organization. However, Edgar Schein suggests that a psychological contract represents more than what the person might think as fair compensation for work rendered, but also a pattern of rights, privileges, and obligations between the worker and organization. So in other words, you don't just work just for the dollar. You also work because that organization embraces you. You identify with its mission, you identify with its goals, and the organization also identifies with the value that you're bringing to the workplace. So there is some kind of a contract, an exchange between you and the organization. So I was looking at a number of things. Number one, one of the propositions that I had is workplace bullying is an observable workplace behavior with implications for employee innovative behavior. The second one is perceived organizational support increases employee innovative workplace behavior. And the third one is organizational support moderates the impacts of workplace bullying on employee innovative behavior. Now, workplace bullying can be measured. Okay, so there are tools out there. The NAQ, and I'm going to show you what that is. There are tools out there to measure what it looks like. Even though we have not been able to agree on what a definition is, we can actually count the incidences and classify them and come up with, a number, all right? So perceived organizational support can also be measured, as well as innovation or innovative behavior can be measured, okay? So these are my variables. So when I was talking about the NAQ or the NAQR, these are some of the tools or instruments that researchers use. But going earlier, there was, of course, the Lehman inventory of psychological terror. And I know we talked about what is psychological terror, what does that mean? It conjures up certain things. But that's been a working definition in the literature for a while. So then the negative acts questionnaire that you can then provide to a sample or even a population in order to be able to count what the incidences look like and be able to plot them. The innovative behavior is measurable as well, as I mentioned. There are tools out there. One of them is a 6-item instrument conceptualized by Scott and Bruce, 1994. And then POS can also be measured, and there is an instrument for doing that by the same folks. Okay, I think I rushed through. Okay. In the context of workplace bullying, expected exchanges, I talked about the exchange between the employee and the organization, can include tangibles and intangibles such as work products for monetary compensation, acknowledgement, support, for example, funding, especially if you're thinking about research or for faculty or even for any research organizations. So support, approval, or where the product is less than expected. Sometimes the expected exchange could be, if it's less than expected in terms of quantity or quality, the exchange can be a reprimand, a warning, or even termination. Where there is a power imbalance, there is potential for abuse. Denise Rizzo advanced the definition of social exchange by indicating that it is a reciprocal exchange between that focal person and another party. Key issues include here the belief that a promise has been made and a consideration offered in exchange for it, thus binding the parties to some sort of a reciprocal obligation. So I come to work, I engage in creative behavior, you support me. You provide a safe environment for me to be able to do that. Okay? 3 minutes to go?
Yeah.
For real?
Yeah.
Okay. Expected exchanges create norms, and norms create safety. Workplace bullying creates employee safety. Threatens employee safety. A sense of safety is essential for employees to devote attention and energies to innovative behavior. It is suggested here that the expected exchange is safety for innovation. You give me safety, I give you innovation. Okay? So if you give me an environment that is safe, I will be creative. I will be able to take risks, and it will be safe for me to do so. And in taking risks, I'll come up with these great ideas that you want me to be able to provide the organization. According to Martin and Cullen, a major component of the work climate is a set of agreed upon psychological, meaningful, and ethical procedures and practices. These procedures and practices help to direct the interpretation of events and actions within the organization, and in so doing provide stability. It is when these norms are violated, such as in the case of workplace bullying or abusive supervision, that expected workplace behavior such as product and service development can be interrupted as people figure out new ways to conduct themselves in a way in view of the psychological contract violation. So I talked about the psychological contract. When that contract is violated, the energies move away from the creative and innovative behavior into self-preservation, or how do I survive from day one to day two. Maybe begin to look for work because now you're thinking I need to exit the organization and so on. So the energies that you would otherwise give to the organization, you move those energies somewhere else. Skip. Oh, okay. I talked about the ability to count and chart, and this just simply shows you how workplace behavior affects innovative behavior. Okay, so where there is a lot of innovation, then it is expected that workplace bullying will be less. Or where there's a lot of workplace bullying, then there is less innovative behavior. And then perceived organizational support, where people feel supported, it increases creative behavior or innovative workplace behavior. And then in the case where, of course, there is the perception of support, people also perceive the effects of workplace behavior as less effective, in the sense that if I know that my boss will support me, if my colleague is bullying me, I can ignore that. Okay? If the organization has policies and procedures that can address this behavior, and I feel safe to continue with my innovative behavior, even if this group of people over here are bullying me, they're not impacting me as much. So some of the literature is producing a lot of that.
Was that your finding, Rosette, or is?
Yeah, so from the literature, yes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Let's go back. These are not real numbers, these are dummy,
Right.
but I just put them there to just show what I was finding in the literature. Those are dummy. Of course, the downward effect of workplace bullying on innovative behavior and organizational performance. It is expected that where you find workplace bullying, it presses down on innovative behavior, which presses down on organizational performance. Okay, and then when you have perceived organizational support, innovative behavior goes up, organizational performance goes up, but then it also has a downward push on workplace bullying. And this is just, that other picture just presented a little bit differently. And in this case here, I put the psychological contract in the middle of that. So it is not a tangible contract that you sign, but it is understood. When you start to work at an organization, it is understood that that organization will support you and that they will create a safe environment, a psychologically safe environment for you to be able to engage in innovative behavior, creative behavior, and come up with new ideas. When that is not the case, and when there are incidences, high incidences of workplace bullying, then the creative behavior goes down. And there is a breach or perceived breach of that psychological contract. And that's that. If you need more, we can talk about it during the Q&A.